Hello, everybody. Today we have Professor Hanna Diamond with us. She's a historian uncovering the untold stories of France during the Second World War. She's also the author of the book called Josephine Baker's Secret War, which reveals how the famous performer secretly aided the French resistance. Before we begin, I would like to welcome Professor Hanna Diamond to our channel and welcome her. And thank her very much, especially for making the time and speaking with us. Thank you so much, Professor, and welcome to our channel.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Awesome. Hannah, Professor, please tell us. Can you please tell us a little about where you're from and what first drew you to history?
Well, I was brought up in London, and my parents were very conscious of history and used to talk about the history around us. But actually, it wasn't till I went to Paris when I was about 14 and fell in love with France that I really developed a taste for history, because in that city, history's all around you. The French Revolution, the developments of the 19th century, the way it's built. You are sort of living and breathing history, and I think that's the root of my passion for history.
Yeah. So, what sparked your interest in the everyday lives of people in France during the Second World War?
Well, when I was a student at the University of Sussex, history was going through a phase where it was moving from focusing on kings and queens and rulers to thinking about ordinary people and their lives, what we call bottom up history, if you like. And at that time, I was working with a professor who was a specialist on the French Resistance, and he encouraged me to look more deeply into people's lives at that time, particularly the lives of women, which had really been overlooked. And that became the subject of my doctorate thesis.
So, how did Josephine Baker come on your radar? And what made you decide to dedicate an entire book to her?
Well, although I've spent a lot of time researching and thinking about the Second World War, I have to be honest and say that Josephine Baker hadn't really crossed my radar. It was only when I was approached and asked to do some research about her that I realised what an extraordinary story it was. Here she was, this amazing international star of music hall who could dance, who could sing, who was also a film star. And she managed to use her celebrity as a cover to work as a spy for the Allies and for the Free French Resistance. And when I started to dig a bit more, I found that there really was quite an extraordinary story to be told. Hence my book.
Yeah, that's great. At what point did you realize there was more to her story than just a public persona?
Well, when I started doing this research, one of the most valuable sources to start me off were some memoirs. First of all, there's Josephine Baker's memoir herself, well, a collection of her writings put together very soon after she died by her then husband, but also a memoir actually called Josephine Baker's Secret War as well, by the man, Jacques Abte, that she worked with. He was spied as well. He was like her handler, if you like. And through those stories, that I was able to kind of build an archival trail to cross-check and uncover documents and sources that really revealed the extent of what she'd done.
So, during your research, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about her role in the French resistance?
Well, I think there were a couple of things that really surprised me. The first thing I think is that here was Josephine Baker. She had enormous recognition. She was so famous. Everyone knew who she was. Crowds followed her everywhere. She's not, I suppose, a traditional kind of spy. When we think of a spy, we think of someone who melts into the crowd and passes unnoticed. And this wasn't at all the case for Josephine Baker. She took advantage of her celebrity to meet the people she needed who were in the know, who could supply her with information, but also as an excuse to get around and get that information to the Allies, to the people of the French resistance, who the information she had could be useful to. What I think was really surprised me the most about that is no one ever suspected her. They only ever saw this celebrity, rather eccentric figure wearing her furs and her fine clothes, and she had a very warm and friendly manner about her, and she never fell under suspicion because if she had, it could have been very unpleasant for her if the Nazis had caught up with her and found out what she did. The second thing that really surprised me is that although we have some knowledge, we'd heard the stories about Josephine Baker's work for the Allies. I uncovered a whole additional chapter of her activities for General de Gaulle and the Free French Resistance in the later part of the war from 1943 to 45, where she worked tirelessly entertaining troops, collecting information, and passing it on in that second chapter to General de Gaulle and his Free French movement. So that was a completely new discovery.
So, how did she manage to use her fame to move around without raising suspicion?
Well, as I've said, it's quite surprising that she did manage to pull it off. I think it's because people underestimated her. Because she was a performer, she had many layers. She had this professional exterior as a star, and people felt that they get to know her, felt that they'd got to know her, but they didn't really see who she was underneath. She was very good at disguising what was really going on. And she was able to persuade people gently to be perhaps a little bit indiscreet. She'd be invited to embassies, to receptions, and she would sweep in, playing her role as the great star. And these diplomats, these people in the know, would be completely starstruck. And it never occurred to them that she could be priming them to get information. There's a lovely story, for example, about her going into the Italian embassy during the Phoney War in 1939 and being able to pick up lots of information about Mussolini's wartime ambitions and report them back to her hierarchy, who found it very useful information. Of course, Mussolini was quite interested in joining forces with Hitler. But so her contacts, her networks were very important. And also the fact that her celebrity meant she was able to get around quite simply. In a time of war, borders are shut and people can't easily travel, except if you're Josephine Baker. So if Josephine Baker said, I need to go to Spain and do a series of concerts, excuse me, nobody refused her the visas and the positions she needed, whereas others, including her handler, Jacques Apte, actually found it impossible to get those permissions. So she knew the people who could give her the information she wanted, and she could get around to get that information to the people who could use it and help the war effort with that information.
Why do you think stories like hers, especially about women, have often been overlooked?
Well, I think if I'm honest with you, I think there's tended to be a bit of a focus on men in history, and women have had a bit of a bad deal. They've been pushed out of the picture, particularly when it comes to the French resistance and the Second World War, which is my area. It was only in the 80s and 90s that we really began to recognize that women had played a really important that we recognised the role played by women, that the men who'd been in the resistance, who'd assassinated the Germans, who'd organized in resistance groups, couldn't have survived without the help of women at home, acquiring food, looking after Jews and others who were being tracked by the Nazis and the Vichy regime. And that, in fact, women may have done a different kind of resistance, but their resistance, though it might have been more difficult to see because women carried on with their everyday lives, and there's an expression we use which is quite helpful here. They would hide in plain sight, much like Josephine Baker. She was doing this activity, but nobody was aware of it. They were hiding in plain sight. And so their contribution went unnoticed until much later when those activities were finally revealed.
But what kept her wartime contributions out of the spotlight for so long?
Well, I think it's partly due to that, due to the fact that it was kind of glossed over. Um, Also, I think, particularly where Josephine Baker is concerned, people in France, for example, were very focused on her activities as a music hall star,
Mm.
the films she did, the way in which an African American woman, chose to make her life in France, to turn her back on the US because it was wonderful for her to be able to escape segregation. Life was very difficult for African Americans, and she could never have experienced that kind of fame in the US. So I think there's a big focus on that period of her life and how she became such an enormous star and her very particular way of dancing, which was some people found that she had this kind of, she didn't wear a lot of clothes, it had to be said, and she had a rather electrifying way of moving that shocked some people and fascinated others, but really everyone talked about her. So in France, they focused on that. In the US, in America,
Yes.
she's much better known for her post war activities as a civil rights activist. She was she worked very hard in the battle for equality for African Americans over there. And she was actually in 1963 involved in the March on Washington when Martin Luther King gave that extraordinary I Have a Dream speech. So, this period of the Second World War that I've focused on sort of gets overlooked as being important. I have to also add she was a spy, so a lot of what she did was secret, and she herself never really talked about it in her life. She was recognized, she got medals, but in later life, she would just say, oh, there was a bit of local difficulty. I did what I could to help. So she also minimized the importance of what she'd done.
So from your work with the museums and public history, how do you make these complex wartime stories connect with people today?
Well, I think Josephine Baker's story is a case in point, isn't it? It's here's this wonderful, glamorous woman who's using her position as a platform to do all this other work. She also used it to promote anti-racist ideas, and she understood the dangers of Nazism. And I think trying to convey these stories about individuals is a way for us to, yeah, to engage younger people. You know, it's true that now the Second World War generation is no longer with us. They've disappeared, sadly. The relevance of that past, if it's not something that your grandparents or your parents experienced, those stories that used to be passed down are a little bit too distant, I think, for the young. Okay, so the Second World War, but there are other wars. You know, what about the Vietnam War? What about other wars that have gone on? What's so special about that war? And I think we as historians have a responsibility to carry on talking about these traumatic and difficult times and trying to convey the importance of those who fought for freedom and that we have a responsibility and a duty to protect that.
Is there a real story from your research that really captures the courage or suffering of ordinary people in wartime France?
Well, obviously, I'm going to tell you about, I have, because I met many women who'd lived through the Second World War in France and joined the resistance and done extraordinary things. It's really hard to select just one story, but I think what it's worth remembering is, many people told me that after that during the Second World War, they never encountered resistance. They never had an opportunity to do it. But those that did, one woman told me that she was out in the market shopping, and all of a sudden she got an approach and she was asked if she would shelter two Allied airmen, two Allied airmen in occupied France with Germans in the town. It was an incredibly dangerous situation for her to take on, but without thinking, she immediately said yes. And she hid those airmen in her attic, and they were able to escape detection and through an escape network get out of France and returned to the UK and carry on. They were RAF airmen and carry on the battle. And it's thanks to the bravery of that woman who was in the market doing her shopping. So sometimes these decisions are just a matter of seconds. Will you do it or won't you? And I think for me that was one of the most telling examples that came out of my research about that period. Yes.
How do you see the younger generations in France remembering the Second World War comparing to the older ones?
Well, I think, as I've said already, it's a bit more of a struggle to engage them because it has less relevance for them. Although there are ways in which I think there are many films about the Second World War and even computer games. I know that young people enjoy playing computer games, and there are increasing number of computer games now set during this period, like reconstructing the past, not just the Second World War, but other periods in time. Of course, with older people, I did an exhibition in 2020 on the French Exodus, which is the period in 1940 when French people fled the German invasion of France. And many, many people came to talk to me and said that their own parents and their own grandparents had told stories of what had gone on then. And although it wasn't a very glamorous it was a difficult historical moment. They were delighted to see it being discussed openly in a museum. So I think it's much easier for us to relate to those older generations, whereas, yeah, I think we have to work a bit harder to get younger people to find it interesting. I know they sort of all go, oh, boring.
Yeah. So, if Josephine Baker were alive today, what message do you think she'd want to share with the world?
Well, Josephine Baker was not one to keep quiet. She tended to say what she thought to whoever happened to be listening to her. Um, and she had very strong principles. She believed in equality and tolerance, and I think she would want us to take her legacy as being here was someone who came from a very underprivileged, really almost destitute background, who was able to make something of herself, get to France, become a star. She could have just sat back, enjoyed the wealth and the celebrity that she had acquired, but she went on to better herself. She learned to sing. She became a film star. And then when the war came, she threw all her energy at helping the Allied war effort and the French resistance, learning to use her stardom to advance the causes she believed in. And she went on in the post-war period to carry on the anti-racist cause in the battle for civil rights in the US. So I think we can take from that a lesson about we should look at our own situations, take advantage of those opportunities to really fight for a better world as we see it.
Thank you so much, Professor, sharing all this valuable information and knowledge with us. It was great hearing all these wonderful stories and information from you. We wish you continuous success in all aspects of your life. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good day. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank
Thank
you,
you very
Professor.
much.
Bye.